Hi, and welcome to the lesson on ethics in the professional workforce. As I've mentioned, this lesson has a different emphasis than most of the rest of the course because instead of talking about the ethics of technical issues that can arise in data science, topics like recommender systems that we saw previously or facial recognition that we're going to see soon, this talks about the ethics of how people are treated in the professional workplace. We're going to concentrate on tech companies for two reasons. One is that this is where a lot of data science is practiced. And secondly, they're quite visible. And so a lot of stories in the media come from these companies, particularly the large ones. Hopefully, there is some degree of parallel between what we covered here from these stories and what you would see in other companies where data science is practiced. It should be emphasized, since these stories are going to put these companies in bad lights, that there's lots of great things just working in the companies that are mentioned and others like them. I certainly know plenty of people who work at the companies that are mentioned and others like them, and generally they regard them as great environments. They get to work with a lot of smart people, you get to work on interesting problems, never boring, fast-paced, and very innovative. But there are issues about the way people are treated at these companies. Some of this relates to the fact that these companies tend to be dominated by white and Asian males, and therefore women and people from underrepresented groups are sometimes not treated the way they should be. Sometimes that's intentional, sometimes not, but it does work out that way. So again, the objective is not to denigrate any company, but simply to open our eyes to things that can happen in any workplace, and hopefully to be alert to avoiding them in our own professional careers and in the actions that we take as computing professionals or as data science professionals. So there are no shortage of examples, and it's easy to assemble a long reading list on these topics. The one that I have here, I've still had to pick and choose from many more possibilities, but it's still a fairly long list. It's also a very interesting one. So I hope that you will at least look at all of the articles, read some of them carefully, and skim the rest of them. In this module, what I'll do is summarize key points from each of the articles and make comments and observations about them. Then what I'm going to ask you to do in a discussion group is make your own comments about at least two of the articles that you've read, and also comment on the comments that your fellow students have made in at least two cases. Before going forward with that, as always, the virtual backgrounds. First, the one from the last class. You may remember that that was a large white building in a wide open space. You may have guessed, even though that building probably could be anywhere in the world by now, or many places, that it's most likely to have been in the Middle East, and that's exactly correct. It turns out to be in the United Arab Emirates. It's in, or from, I should say, a trip that I made to UAE as part of an advisory group to United Arab Emirates University. Now, if you've heard of cities in the UAE, you've probably most likely heard of Dubai and or Abu Dhabi, which are the two big cities on the coast. That's not where this university is. This university is in a city called Al Ain, which is an old oasis city inland. It's actually near the border of Oman. It was the home, or is the home, of a sheikh who's got an important role with the university and who invited our visiting committee there for lunch. And I've got to say that of all the lunches I've had in the world, I probably never have had one before or ever will have one again that matches this one in terms of the variety, the quality, or the quantity of the food. And for today's virtual background, it's pretty clearly not the Middle East. It's pretty clearly a city with some history to it. And it's actually a city that has some relation to the topic of today's discussion about the professional technical workforce. So I'll let you give your guesses in the discussion group where it is. Some of you may know this isn't the hardest one to guess, and then we'll come back to this one a little bit at the start of the next lesson. So now we'll start talking about the articles. There's quite a broad variety of topics in these articles, quite a variety of perspectives. The first one is the piece written by Dana Boyd. This is really a very interesting and powerful statement, in my opinion. Some of you may have heard of Dana Boyd. She's a very well-known researcher and scientist in the area of technology and social media and the merger of those two things. She has a background that gives her abilities on both of those sides. A computer science BS from Brown University, master's from the Media Lab at MIT, and she refers to her time at MIT Media Lab in this article, and then a PhD from the Berkeley School of Information, which supplied more of the social science side of what she does. And the occasion for these remarks, which she gives in this article, was receiving a major award from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And it's interesting that that is a group that was formed to support internet civil liberties. So it's a group which is by itself on the ethics side of the computing world. And so it's particularly interesting and powerful that she took the occasion of getting a group from what are kind of closer to the good guys of the ethics and computing world to challenge those people, as well as all of the tech industry. Now, the timing's important. The timing of her receiving this award came very closely on the heels of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal blowing up in the year 2019. You're probably, or at least many of you, familiar with that scandal. Epstein was an alleged sexual predator who'd been a donor and a powerful voice at the MIT Media Lab, among other places. The article mentions other famous people as well, and I could remark on the people, but I think I will instead go directly to some of the things she says about the tech industry that are particularly meaningful for us to consider. And I think this is another case where it's useful to directly quote a few of the things she said, so I'm going to quote 4 of them. First, Dana said, "Change also means that the ideas and concerns of all people need to be a part of the design phase and the auditing of systems, even if this slows down the process. We need to bring back and reinvigorate the profession of quality assurance so that products are not launched without systematic consideration of the harms that might occur." Second, she wrote, quote, well, the phrase that she quotes, "Move and break things is an abomination if your goal is to create a healthy society." I'm going to comment on each of these last 2 ones shortly. The third thing I'm quoting from her, she said, "Let's stop designing the technologies envisioned in dystopian novels. We need to heed the warnings of artists, not race head on into their nightmares." A very poignant way to say things. And finally, and she actually said this one earlier than the other 3, she said, "If change is going to happen, values and ethics need to have a seat in the boardroom." If we were looking for a slogan for this course, that wouldn't be a bad one to consider. So what are some key points from those comments, or key comments to make about them? The first one, where she talks about listening to the concerns of a variety of people. That's what diversity is about. Diversity is about listening to different voices and different experiences. And the thing one has to admit is diversity does not usually buy speed. If you wanted to come to a consensus most quickly, you ought to find 5 people who grew up with you, who have exactly the same experiences and values as you, and you'll probably all agree and come to a conclusion very quickly. But it might not be the right one, or it might not consider as much breadth as you're going to get from bringing in people with a much more diverse set of experiences. So there is a trade-off. Diversity can slow things down, but generally, and there are analyses and economic analyses to support this, it improves the results. And so that's one of the points that Boyd is making that I think is very important. A second point that she emphasizes is that we need to take responsibility for what we're producing. There are a lot of instances in the tech industry in particular where things come out quickly, they have unintended consequences, and the response is kind of like an, oops, well, we didn't have time to think about that, we'll fix it. And often fixing it is too late, damage already has been done. So this again is the trade-off between speed and thoughtfulness that she's talking about. And that then gets to the motto that Boyd talks about in her remarks, which is the phrase, move fast and break things. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. That's been one of the cool phrases of the tech entrepreneurial world for a while. And it's got good and bad. Like most discussions in this course, there isn't a one side that is absolutely right and another side that is absolutely wrong, at least in most cases. I also doubt that that mentality will go away, but I think it's very important for people like Boyd to make us think about that and make us think that there are real trade-offs and perhaps we need to aim somewhere in between. So to conclude this conversation about the Dana Boyd article, which I certainly hope that you take a look at, it's a very meaningful one, a little bit of optimism in that she's not the only person saying this. And as I talk to leaders in tech companies these days, and that leadership often is much more diverse these days than it was before, I think the points that are made here are being considered, but they will need to be continued to be considered, and there still is quite a long ways to go. Next, I'll turn to the article about GitHub, which is a much briefer and simpler article. And it makes a very simple, clear point that the contributions by women to GitHub are actually rated better than the contributions by men, as long as the gender is not known. And the reverse begins to happen when the gender is known. GitHub is overwhelmingly male, a little over 90%, according to this article. And the way they are ranking how the contributions are rated is how much the code fixes are picked up on. So this phenomenon is a common and well-known one. And it's very likely, although it doesn't say this, that at least a part of this is due to unconscious bias. I hope that many of you are familiar with the concept of unconscious bias. It's the fact that people, both men and women, will make prejudicial judgments, in many cases unconsciously, without realizing that they're doing it or without, in some conscious sense, intending to do that. And for instance, both men and women will rate things by men better than things by women. And both majority and underrepresented groups will rate things from majority groups better than things from underrepresented groups. That's what the unconscious bias is about. There are ways to overcome that, and the simplest one is a more blind evaluation where you do not know the gender, racial, or other identity characteristics of the person as you're looking at things. And that's, in some sense, what was going on in GitHub. When you're doing it blind, you rate things differently than you're not. So this brings up biases, including unconscious biases. And if you're not familiar with that concept, it's one that I hope you'll look into. Next, we'll turn to two articles about a very highly publicized and ultimately broadly and highly consequential case from Uber. The first is an article written by Susan Fowler, an ex-Uber engineer, about her experience at Uber, which is what this whole discussion is about. To put it bluntly and mildly, she immediately faced highly unprofessional behavior as she started in her position at Uber, being basically propositioned by her manager, which immediately puts you in a lose-lose situation. Now, she hoped that maybe by going to HR, she could find some decent way out of that, and that went very badly. HR said that they didn't want to take any significant action against the manager because the manager was a high performer. And I'm going to choose to concentrate on that aspect of the many points that Fowler makes for the purpose of this class discussion, because this is a pattern that one sees too often in workplaces of all sorts of, not just technical workplaces, but many workplaces, where there's a person who is in some way treating others badly, but the management wants to turn the other way because that person is in another way a high performer. Many of you will ultimately be in leadership positions where you have to confront a situation like that, where somebody, a manager working for you, is distinguishing that type of characteristic. They perform very well for the company in many ways, but they're treating the employees under them or other people in the company poorly. And the question then is, how will you react to that situation? My suggestion is that one absolutely has to consider the personal treatment as well as the professional results, but each person makes that decision. And to kind of highlight that there are various ways of looking at that, let's think for a second about our ethical frameworks. What that HR person was doing was basically taking a utilitarian approach. And they were implicitly saying that the positives for what that person does for the company, perhaps in technical results or in bringing products to market or who knows what, are more important, way more, than the negatives about how they were treating this employee and very likely other employees. Now, if we looked at that from the point of virtue ethics, there'd be no discussion. The way the person was acting was not virtuous, period. If we looked at it from a Kantian point of view, you can certainly argue that not sexually harassing anybody is a categorical imperative. So again, no question about it. So one of the things this points out is the importance of having these ethical frameworks in our back pocket, because if nothing else, they're a looking glass, a mirror that we can look into and saying, how are we making our decisions? Now, there's plenty more to the Fowler article. I encourage you to look at it, but I've decided just to highlight those aspects of it for our discussion today. Now let's turn to the second article about that case, the New York Times article, which was written well after Fowler wrote her article. What happened is that the Fowler story had a huge public impact, and then Uber brought in two very highly respected and high-level independent people to investigate. One, the former U.S. Attorney General in the Obama administration, and those two people produced what has to be considered a searing report about Uber. Some of the comments that they made seem to have quite a bit of similarity to the Dana Boyd comments. They recommended that the company eliminate some of its official core values, slogans very much like the ones Boyd talked about. In the case of Uber, slogans including always be hustling, principled confrontation, and let builders build, and slogans that they felt had been used by the company to allow poor personal behavior to go untouched and unreprimanded. I'll mention one other thing that was written in the New York Times article. I'll quote it. It, meaning the report, also said that workplace rules governing sexual harassment and other prohibited behavior should extend to off-site conferences and meetings. I have to admit that my reaction to that was, duh, like you actually have to say that? But I guess you do. And I guess, and this is to not try to be flip about it, it's clearly the experience of many women in professional situations that behavior exists, and it's the responsibility of all of us to assure that it does not continue to exist. Now, the New York Times article concludes by saying that while the candor of the external report was unusual, it didn't address the culpability of the Uber CEO at the time, a man named Travis Kalanick, who was a well-known serial entrepreneur. But to complete the story, soon after that, that pile of bricks fell down as well. There were a number of other things that came out, and the CEO initially took a leave of absence, resigned a few months after that, remained on the board for, I think it may have actually been a couple of years, but eventually even left the board. So this case eventually did have a very major impact on the leadership, and as far as one can tell, on the culture of that company, Uber.